long waits or the unreliability of the public system as the reason why. In a new paper published in the New Zealand Medical Journal, Dr. Eric Monasterio examines whether we are in fact rapidly moving towards the privatisation of healthcare in Aotearoa, and if so, why. Eric joins me now. Hello.
Good afternoon.
What got you interested in this?
Well, it's impossible not to be as a medical practitioner and a specialist. It's unconscionable and illogical not to. As you say, 35% of New Zealanders are obtaining private health insurance because they're losing trust or can't have access to public health services. That's a significant issue. From my perspective, it's impossible not to address this issue.
Are
the failing system.
Are there any other signs of privatisation other than private insurance, or is that our measure?
Well, people are paying out of pocket for private insurance because of delay with the public health service access, but also the direction of travel for the government is to privatise aspects of the public healthcare system. For example, privatising surgical procedures, privatising the building of hospitals. So it's at an individual and at a government level that this is occurring.
What do you mean by private?
Idea.
Yeah, what do you mean by privatising hospitals, privatising surgeries?
Well, what is happening is that a number of surgical procedures are being transferred to the private service, so to private hospitals and providers, because the public health service is not able to keep up. And the development of hospital infrastructure and health infrastructure is occurring in private and public partnerships. So that moves away from a public healthcare model, and it's well established that doing so does not deliver good, equitable and financially sound outcomes.
How is it divided up? The treatment that gets undertaken by private and undertaken by public? Is it that the private healthcare picks up some of the, I don't know, for lack of a better term, easier stuff or more routine stuff, and the public system picks up the more serious and expensive issues?
Medical emergencies remain within the public system because of the infrastructure and the complexity, but less acute or complex procedures are being diverted to the private system because of lack of capacity in the public service. Increasingly, that's occurring because of the long wait lists, and as the public health system tends to underperform, then people, specialists are also leaving into the private sector. The long-term consequences of that is that money and expertise will shift across to the private system, which is not as efficient as a public system. So it basically feeds into privatisation of healthcare, and we know that that's not a good idea from international studies.
Increasing privatisation leads to more privatisation, hey?
It does, and also individuals who are on long wait lists and no longer trust that they can get access to the public service are paying for insurance out of pocket or paying for care out of pocket. Now, that seems attractive at a point in your life. So, for example, if you're young and you think, well, if I need a routine procedure, that will not happen in the public health system. Therefore, I will pay my insurance premium to have access to the private system. But while you're young and fit and have a good income, you're able to pay for your health insurance. As you get older and the cumulative burden of disease catches up with you, your premiums increase quite rapidly. In fact, well beyond inflation. Now, what we know is up to 20 or 30% of New Zealanders are bailing out of private insurance at a time in their life when they need it most, in their 60s or 70s, because the premiums are no longer affordable to them. They've got a lifelong history of paying for private insurance, but because it's too expensive to keep up, they bail out and then they get sick and then they fall back into the public system. It's a real problem, and it's a problem that will continue to accelerate in New Zealand because of our ageing population.
One of the goals of your paper was to work out if this shift towards privatisation is by design or not. Tell me about that.
Yeah, and it's a question we put out to medical specialists. This is a medical specialist journal. There doesn't seem to be a coherent process, as far as we understand, that seems to be occurring by default in responding to a crisis. In order to deal with a health crisis, we need leadership, we need vision, we need a coherent approach to how we're going to deal with it now and how we're going to deal with it into the future, when we know a lot of the problems that we see now will be significantly accelerated, particularly because of an aging population, the burden of chronic diseases. And chronic diseases account for about 90% of the healthcare costs. They will continue to increase over time. Privatization does nothing to deal with these, because privatization does not increase access to primary care. And New Zealand has got a very poor access to primary care, that is GP care. Up to 30% of New Zealanders can't see a GP. What that means is that early intervention to stop long-term complications from chronic illnesses does not occur. And ultimately, people present very unwell to hospitals with advanced diseases, which are not only expensive to treat, but you have poor outcomes and they're very expensive.
Where are we heading if the current trend continues?
I think we're quite clearly heading to a two-tier system where people with financial resources can have access to private care, and those without it will increasingly miss out. That's a terrible indictment. It's contrary to how we see ourselves as a fair, equitable nation in New Zealand. It will mean that those who are most vulnerable will continue to have delayed or diminished access to care and will present later with a whole range of complications from untreated illnesses. It will mean that people with serious mental illnesses will increasingly end up living homeless or in prisons. Māori and Pacifica population, the health disparity will only increase over time. It's our view, therefore, in the medical profession that this is an urgent issue that needs to be clearly addressed, and we're looking for a cross-party agreement to come up with solutions which are feasible, the best use of money, and have a long-term goal. We've proposed some interventions that might assist in that. The most important thing is it's got to stop being a political football where there's changing ideology between different governments that come into power. It's important to note that in the last 5 years, we've had 6 different ministers of health, each one with slightly different ideas and priorities. And imagine what it's like being a health care practitioner, changing or trying to adapt to all of these different priorities every year or so. It leaves people feeling disenchanted. You need also to bring in medical specialists who have decades of experience, who really are on the front lines, working to have more involvement and say in how we design and carry through our long-term health policy and planning.
Just briefly, if we'd like to change course, what are the options?
The options are to be realistic. The options are to have a mature conversation about where we're at fiscally, what money we have, and we do have a limited amount of money. We're going into a financial crisis, so in all likelihood we have less money. So we need to say, hey, we've got this amount of money, how are we going to use it, and what's the best way to use it? In our opinion, the best way to use it is increase access to primary care so that people can have regular reviews and identify treatable illnesses early rather than later. We need to identify who the biggest priority groups are. We need to have standardized, proven packages of care that deliver good outcomes. And we also need to, in particular, look at investing in health, not as an aspirational thing, but as a wise investment, because for every $1 you invest in health, you get a $5 return in productivity. People who are physically or mentally unwell are unproductive in the workforce, and they're significant recipient of government support. It's important to invest your money in your communities so that those communities are productive. New Zealand has a very low productivity compared to other OECD countries. In my opinion, improving access to healthcare will improve productivity.
Lovely to chat to you. Thanks for your work on this.
Thank you very much for having me online.
Dr. Eric Monasterio, who's written a paper in the New Zealand Medical Journal about the increasing privatisation of our health system. You're on Afternoons. Humans may have more in common with animals than we thought, especially when it comes to attraction. New research suggests we're drawn to the same mating calls as other species, supporting Charles Darwin's observations that animals share, quote, our taste for the beautiful. Dr. Sam Mayer from the University of Auckland and Yale University is the senior author of this new study, and he's with me in the Auckland studio. Hi, Sam.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
Great to see you. Tell me about that Charles Darwin observation and what was his thought process around this idea?
It's really a fascinating observation. I think, as we go about our lives in the world, that we're walking through, we observe lots of things that we find beautiful and things that we find not so beautiful. And Darwin had this really interesting idea, which is that the design of the visual forms and the sounds that we experience are not always intended for us. So when we hear a beautiful bird song, for example, that bird didn't evolve to sing that way to please us. we didn't really play much role in that bird's evolution. So it's really quite a puzzle why humans would find that sort of sound really aesthetically pleasing. So that's kind of the underlying idea behind this research.
Yeah. And so how did you design this experiment?
Well, in human sounds, the idea of what sounds nice or not nice is kind of a controversial topic. If you asked a whole bunch of people, well, give me the sounds that sound nice, you get a bunch of different answers. Anyone who has kids knows that the music that they might be listening to might not be your own favorite kind of music, for example. What's really nice about studying the sounds that other species make is that we know from experiments in those species what that species prefers. So for a sparrow, for example, you can run experiments where you play a female sparrow 2 different male calls, and you see which speaker the sparrow goes towards, and you get a measure of their preference. Yeah. And what Logan James, who's the scientist who led this study in collaboration with my lab, what he did is he collected all sorts of pairs of sounds from many different species, from lots and lots of experiments in biology labs, where for each pair of sounds, we know which one is the nice one. And then we can take those sounds and play them to citizen scientists. Maybe you're a participant in this one yourself, Jesse, on the internet, and we can ask them, okay, here are the 2 sounds. Which one do you like better? And then we can ask, what do the responses look like? Are they similar to the animals, or are they not so similar?
And what did you find?
Well, to our surprise, for quite a few of these species, human preferences for which sound in the pair is the nice one maps quite well onto what the animals themselves prefer. It's not across the board. It's not every species. It's not every sound. But on average, human preferences for the aesthetics of these sounds map onto what each species feels themselves.
Does it differ from species to species? Which ones we're more closely aligned with?
Well, so there's some species where pretty much every sound that we studied, the humans agree with. So there's like a tree frog species, for example. The Tungara frogs also, for some reason, frogs seem to align quite well. There's a Pacific cricket that humans agree with a lot, which is really odd to me. I don't find cricket sounds that aesthetically pleasing myself. Yeah. And then there's some animals for which our preferences are totally the opposite. Interestingly enough, there's one primate species we studied, the gelada monkey from Ethiopia, where their calls just kind of sound weird to us. They're kind of like a moaning sound, and they all sound kind of odd, and human preferences for those were not aligned very much with the gelada.
Which is interesting because presumably they're the closest to us.
Well, that's right. So we actually went into this with the idea that, okay, if we see some preference overlap between humans and other species, maybe it's the case that, the species that are closely related to us, we share sort of more of our evolutionary history, we're closely related, maybe we'll be more similar. And we found very little evidence for that, in fact. So that was a surprise to us as well.
Yeah. Any theories on that?
Well, I think if you think about your own experience of the aesthetics and sound, you think about your own preferences for music or the sounds that you hear in your daily life, it's kind of hard to predict what you're going to like. And I think the most obvious explanation of, animals that are similar to us might have similar aesthetic preferences, it doesn't really pan out in that sense. Similarly, people you're related to, people in your own family may have very different aesthetics.
Announced our national fuel plan. I want to reassure New Zealanders that we have very good fuel supplies and more fuel on the way. But we've also, as a good, responsible government, thinking about a world where we may have fuel disruption into the future, and therefore laying out our 4 phases in that plan as to how we may manage our way through that is very important. But with that, happy to take your questions for the day.
Why do you not feel it's important for you as Prime Minister to lead the fuel response?
Well, I have been. This week we've been doing three things. One is developing the National Fuel Plan. I signed off on that yesterday, and obviously we're not moving any phases. A big part of my week has been talking to world leaders to make sure that we can continue to get fuel supply into New Zealand. That's why I've been talking to the President of South Korea, Prime Minister of Singapore, Malaysia, President of Europe, and also our big focus, as you remember at the beginning of the week, was to make sure that we get timely, targeted, temporary support out to New Zealanders who desperately need it. Well, no, we're a government that's very calm, very measured. We're not panicking, but we do need to think, in a world where we're fortunate that we have good supplies at the moment, but we also need to think about a world where our fuel supply could be disrupted, and therefore lay out the approach by which we would navigate New Zealand through that. Look, the first thing that we have to do is to secure as much of our fuel supply as we possibly can. As we keep saying and trying to reassure New Zealanders, there's no need to hoard. We have minimum stock quantities that we lifted back in 2025. We have ships that are on the way here. But my job is, when we have our oil that comes out of refineries in South Korea predominantly, and Singapore, a little bit of Malaysia and Japan, is to make sure I'm talking to those leaders to make sure I'm getting New Zealand's share of mind up with them. Well, everybody around the world, all leaders around the world, are really worried about the implications of this conflict on their respective economies and what it means and the impact on their people. And that's no different. And we have a debate about that as to how do we ultimately want to see this conflict resolved. But even if it's resolved today, miraculously, we would still have some implications working through the supply chains around the world as oil production was ramped up again. So, all we're doing as a responsible, prudent, calm, measured government is just saying, look, we need to lay up a framework of 4 phases as to how we would navigate our way through it should our situation change. But for right here, right now, job number 1 is to secure our fuel supplies, which we've been doing, because without that, that starts to impact on jobs and incomes for New Zealanders. The second focus has been on saying, if that was to be disrupted in coming months, how would we work our way through that and approach and put a framework around that with the 4 phases. And the third part is to make sure we've learnt the lessons from COVID, that actually firing a cash bazooka around has caused huge amount of pain and suffering for New Zealanders wrestling with high inflation and high interest rates, that we have to make sure any support we offer is timely, it's targeted, and it's temporary. And that's what you saw us do with the support to 143,000 low and middle income working families earlier this week.
Any concern that introducing these phases will actually cause some panic, that people will think they do need to go and stock up?
No, and I've seen reports that there are some isolated rural communities where there has been evidence of some hoarding taking place, but New Zealanders have been really good. And also you have to understand, we lifted our minimum stock holding requirements in early 2025 for this very reason, and our minimum stock holdings are in good shape. We've got more fuel coming on the water to New Zealand, and so our orders have been getting through and our supplies have been in good heart and good shape. But we're just wanting to make sure that our system and our country is ready should there be fuel shocks and disruptions to that supply. And it's quite prudent for us to think about a framework of 4 very simple phases that are triggered by a number of things that ministers in our Ministerial Oversight Group on Fuel Security will think through, that will lead to an assessment in conjunction with industry and with businesses that should New Zealand need to shift to a different phase, we will. But for now, I think New Zealand has done a very good, we've done a good job of making sure we secure our supply lines, and we haven't seen any evidence of that at all. And we talk to the fuel companies daily. We have been right from day one of this conflict for that very reason.
Is there enough detail in those higher levels of those phases? Not a lot of detail here.
Well, there's detail in phase 1, which is being watchful, which is what we've been doing, and our phase 2, which is very much about taking precautionary action, and that's important. If we do our job right in phases 1 and 2, we hope not to have to get to phase 3 and 4. But there is some definition around the thinking in phase 3 and 4 where we'd need to put some prioritisation around certain businesses, essential services, life-saving services. But again, we're going to do that in conjunction with industry and with the services and with the businesses, because I think that again was one of the big learnings out of COVID. And we're very fortunate, having seen a Treasury report last year, having seen a Royal Commission of Inquiry into COVID. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of COVID. And so I just want to be clear. kids are going to school. They're not sitting at home. That was one of the big learnings out of COVID. Our kids lost huge amounts of learning. This is not COVID. This is about a fuel crisis and a fuel security issue that we will continue to manage. It's not a pandemic.
When do you expect you to have more detail about those higher phases?
Well, again, as we said, we're going to continue to work that through with the industry and with businesses. But again, it's a very fluid set of circumstances and situations. We've created 6 criteria that will be triggers for us and that ministerial group to have a reassessment in conjunction with officials, with government, with businesses and with industry. But again, it's important that we are fluid and that we are dynamic and we are agile. We've got a clear framework about what we think the phases will be. And I think we've organised very early around that, and we'll continue to flesh it out as needs be.
Why not just tell people to conserve petrol now?
Well, at the moment, New Zealand has supplies, and we have all our storage facilities full, and we have supplies that we need. We are consciously looking at the fuel situation through the lenses of the 3 types, so diesel, petrol, jet fuel. And it may well be that we move to phase 2 on one type of fuel and not on the others. So we are going to discriminate through the fuel types as well, because they have different roles in our economy. But it's really important we don't make the mistakes of COVID, which caused a huge amount of pain and suffering for New Zealanders because of the economic mismanagement that ensued. And that's why we're just working through secure the supply lines. 2, think about a world where we have further disruption. 3, make sure we get timely, targeted temporary support to people who desperately need it.
Prime Minister, talking about pain and suffering, the city's been through a fair amount in the last 15 years. We've got this beautiful new stadium today, but we've still got a massive hole in the centre of the city. Can we expect the government to stump up on that?
Well, you've had a government that's been very supportive of Christchurch and its infrastructure, and deservedly so, and as it should have done. I think we spent something like $20 billion here rebuilding the city. It's excellent to be here with the new stadium. It's exciting to think about not just the rugby that's going to get played here and the sports, but actually, for every live event we bring to Christchurch, it drives $3.20 back into the local economy, and that's a good thing. And so, we continue to, as a government, we have to make trade-offs and choices about, particularly when we're fiscally constrained, as you've seen over the last week from some of the international assessments of our finances, that we need to make sure that we are directing that money where it needs to most go. But I'm proud of the support this government's put into Christchurch, and we'll continue to make sure we can support where we can.
So what does that mean about the cathedral?
Well, again, the cathedral's got a community-led funding response to that. As you know, they've right-sized the project and doing it in phases. The government has already given, made contributions to the cathedral rebuild. But at this stage, for the rest of New Zealand to say that's schools or hospitals or roads that can't be built because of that investment, we expect that to be a community-led response at this stage.
What are your thoughts on the political advice given to Chris Hipkins?
I think there's a number of competing views on what was received and not received, and how it was interpreted, and what was actioned or not actioned. Ultimately, that's for Chris Hipkins. I think he needs to front on it, and he needs to talk to the New Zealand people about that.
Stadium, going back to the stadium specifically, for that story, the National Party actually brought in the initial bill a couple of days years ago. Seeing the stadium built today, where do you see as the Prime Minister of Christchurch be in terms of its overall recovery from this?
Oh, look, I think Christchurch as an economy is doing incredibly well. I mean, you've got fantastic infrastructure here in the city. You've got moderate, steady, consistent, house price growth, so it's an affordable, more affordable than other parts of the country. A lot of what we want to see happening across the whole of New Zealand, we're actually seeing here in this, in the Canterbury economy. We've seen, you've got great leadership here on the ground. You've got, very high levels of growth happening here. You've got a great quality of life with outstanding infrastructure. And so, as a Cantabrian and a Christchurch boy myself, I'm really proud of the city and what's been achieved.
As a Christchurch boy, just on a personal level, as the Prime Minister, how did it feel to come in here and see the stadium being built into everything Christchurch has been?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I just jumped in the car with my dad over the last 9 months, 12 months, and we'd come out here late at night and sort of drive around the outside and imagine what was actually happening inside. But to walk through the tunnel and to walk into here and to see what is an intimate, enclosed, world-class venue. I mean, the proximity of the spectators, everyone will be able to get a great view here, but the proximity to the ground is just phenomenal. So I'm really proud because, I lived overseas for 16 years. I saw lots of other countries have outstanding stadiums. This is truly, truly world class. And as a consequence, it means that we can attract events that would bypass New Zealand and maybe just go to Australia and never come here because we've now got a world class facility. So it's a really exciting time, and I have great memories of Lancaster Park and watching wonderful events there, but I just, as I said in my remarks, think about the new generation of Cantabrians and Kiwis that are going to make wonderful new memories here in the decades ahead.
Just one more on another topic, please. Reports out today show a record number of hospitalisations for acute respiratory illnesses. What is the government doing to help combat those figures?
Yeah, look, there's been more capacity put into winter beds in our healthcare system. The Minister announced that several weeks ago. I just want to encourage everybody. We've got a big drive around particularly immunisations. It's really important that people are getting some of those basic immunisations in place. If you think about whooping cough, you think about measles, things that we've had challenges around. We've been lifting our immunisation rates well, but I'd encourage people, take the flu shots, take responsibility, do what you can, and make sure that obviously for children in particular we're getting their immunisations in the right place. Okay, thanks team. Have a good day.